dressing gowns. And my subject is a little essay that Diderot wrote in 1769 called Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown. It's a lament. It's a very peculiar essay and a very important essay, I think. And I need to start by saying, I guess, what a dressing gown is, or in French, a robe de chambre. The robe de chambre is an invention of the late 17th century, and it's modeled on the kimono or the kaftan. So it's a part of an Orientalist culture, and it uses new fabrics, often cottons or silks, and therefore it becomes a form of luxurious dress. But Diderot originally lived in a dressing gown that was very different from the dressing gown of sophisticated culture. It was a sort of black cassock, and he used it for cleaning his pen nibs. And when there was dust on his books, he would take his dressing gown and rub his books with it. So his dressing gown was filthy, and it had holes in it. And he lived in it. He was happy in it. He was comfortable in it. It was part of his skin. And he did something that to the French of his day was quite shocking. He went outdoors in it. You were supposed to change out of your dressing gown to go outdoors, and you were supposed to put on a wig. He would go out bareheaded in his dressing gown and visit his friends. He was banned from some houses for this sort of behavior, which was regarded as utterly unacceptable. We don't have a picture of the original Diderot dressing gown. This might be an indication of it. This is a print of a very early portrait of Diderot. But we do have a series of images of Diderot in elegant dressing gowns. Here's the most famous one in a very smart blue dressing gown by a man called Van Loo. Here is another one by the great painter Greuze of him in a grey silk dressing gown. Here is a scarlet dressing gown. And we know from Diderot's essay that he replaced his black cassock with a scarlet dressing gown. And one thinks at first, this is the famous scarlet dressing gown. Unfortunately, it isn't. Although it's painted after 1769 and after Diderot acquired the scarlet dressing gown, because when you went round to an artist, he would often lend you an outfit, particularly if you were like Diderot and didn't dress very well. And this is the artist's own dressing gown. And we know this because artists would regularly, in the case of Van Loo, we have self-portraits of Van Loo wearing this same dressing gown. And in this case of the scarlet dressing gown, we have other sitters to this artist wearing this same dressing gown. So unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Diderot in the scarlet dressing gown. But something remarkable happened after Diderot had acquired the scarlet dressing gown, which we must assume was sometime in 1768. Because he sat there in his study wearing his smart dressing gown, which was stiff and new, and didn't really feel comfortable at all. And he looked around, and the place was a mess. There were piles of books on the floor. There were papers all over the pine table. There was a little shelf with some battered copies of Cicero. Stuck on the walls, there were prints stuck on with sort of thumbtacks. There was an old rug made out of rags. There was a hanging, which was not a tapestry, but it was just a sort of abstract. I've called it a burgamesque hanging, which is just a sort of abstract, bright-coloured thing. And he looked around and he felt ashamed of his own study because now he had a smart dressing gown. And so slowly, bit by bit, he removed the old study and replaced it. An elegant marquetry bureau came in which the books and the papers were hidden away. The prints that were stuck to the wall were taken down and replaced by a painting he believed was by Raphael, for example. Very fine works of art. He had some little plaster casts, and they were replaced by an elegant bronze Venus. And slowly, over a period of a few months, he smartened his room up until it was an elegant room, because the dressing gown required nothing less. And it's at this point that his friend Grimm came round to visit him with. Grimm ran a little magazine which was handwritten and was circulated to the royal houses of Europe, who received it as a handwritten text. Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great of Prussia and so on. There were a dozen copies only. It's a very, very niche object. And Grimm came round to visit Diderot to introduce him to a friend, a minor member of the German nobility. And he was shocked. He'd come to see the philosopher doing what philosophers do, scribbling away, surrounded by books and papers, and instead there was this elegant person sitting here whom he could hardly recognize. So, of course, as you do with your friends, he teased him. And Diderot's response was to write, "Regrets on parting with my old dressing gown." And a Canadian anthropologist called Grant McCracken has described the process whereby Diderot realized that his dressing gown required of him that he must change the whole room in which he sat. He's described this as the Diderot effect. You buy something, and then you must buy other things that go with it. And the other things that go with it he calls a Diderot unity. So you buy a Mercedes car, and you sit in it and you think, but no, I need to have a Rolex watch. A driver of a Mercedes car has to have a Rolex watch. And slowly, you acquire all these new things. Diderot runs into debt, he tells us, to do this. He hasn't provided for the future financial welfare of his wife and his daughter, but at least he's got all these fancy objects. Things like this. This is a Geoffrin clock. The woman sitting here, who's supposed to be representing leisure and study, is Madame Geoffrin. It's named after her. And Diderot says, I've got myself a Geoffrin clock sitting on the mantelpiece. And this is the sort of elegance that he's now acquiring of objects of great luxury and expense. And Diderot effect points to something that's really peculiar about market society and consumerism, which is that the standard account of why you buy things, account you'll see running through Adam Smith most of the time, is you buy things because they're either useful. 18th century England, people start putting glass in windows instead of parchment. This is great improvement, more light, better protection against drafts and so on. What was a luxury quickly becomes seen as a necessity. So you buy things that are useful. Or you buy things because they give you status. You acquire a carriage because your neighbors will see you riding by high up and admire you for it. And utility and social status, public and effective expenditure, rational expenditure, you might say, are the model of market activity. But Adam Smith noticed that there's another sort of expenditure that goes on. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he writes this: a watch that falls behind above 2 minutes a day is despised by one curious in watches. He sells it, perhaps for a couple of guineas, and purchases another at 50. 50 guineas is a fortune in the world of Adam Smith, which will not lose above a minute in a fortnight. The sole use of watches, however, is to tell us what o'clock it is, and to hinder us from breaking any engagement or suffering any other inconveniency by our ignorance in that particular point. But the person so nice with regard to this machine will not always be found either more scrupulously punctual than other men, or more anxiously concerned upon any other account to know precisely what time of day it is. So this watch is no more useful than a cheap watch. What interests him is not so much the attainment of this piece of knowledge, the time, as the perfection of the machine which serves to attain it. 1759, Theory of Moral Sentiments. In 1753, the great Harrison, the man who created the clock that was used to calculate longitude, invented a new watch. This is not one of his, because the Science Museum, irritatingly, has not put on this. They own a copy, but they haven't put it on. This is a later version. He invented a watch which had a bimetallic strip in it so that it would alter the rate of which it ticked depending upon the outside temperature. So that instead of the watch running faster on a hot day and slower on a cold day, this bimetallic strip would slow it down on hot days and speed it up on cold days to regulate it. And this wonderful watch of 1753 is also designed so that when you wind it, it doesn't stop going. Because otherwise, every time you wound your watch, the watch stopped, and consequently, you had to reset it. No, this watch kept going as you wound it. This is the sort of thing that people were paying 50 guineas for. And Adam Smith thinks this is bonkers. You know, it's obsessive behavior. But you can sort of see that they do it because they love something. The other example he gives of this sort of mad behavior is people who spend a fortune on what Adam Smith calls tweezer cases. Antique dealers now call these étuis, but they contain little tweezers with which you do your manicure and so on. And they cost a fortune. They're provided by examples of contemporaries telling you their sons don't, under any circumstances, buy this sort of thing because this is just wasteful. Now, there's a sense in which what Diderot was doing in buying all this fancy new furniture was engaging in this sort of obsessive behavior. Why does he do it? He himself doesn't quite know what the answer to that question is. This is, I think, the striking thing about Diderot's essay. He's been taken possession of by the dressing gown. It's the dressing gown that requires him to do this. He wants to be the sort of person who is elegant and sophisticated and has fine taste, even though he hasn't got the means for that taste. But he also wants to insist, and as he does to Grimm, he hasn't become that sort of elegant person at all, because if you come round to visit him, he'll still be as friendly and easy and as relaxed with you as he always was. He says, I will now. Whether I will always be like this, I'm not so sure. He's not sure if the new possessions are changing who he is, or whether he's remaining the same despite the new possessions. And his way of thinking about this problem is to refer to two Greek philosophers and a courtesan. Diogenes, who used to live in the barrel, becomes a model for Diderot of the change in his old world. He used to be a philosopher who lived in a barrel. And Lais, the famous courtesan, used to give herself free to Diogenes because she knew Diogenes had no money, but he was a good chap and a philosopher, and he deserved a good time as much as anybody else, and she would provide one. Meanwhile, Aristippus was the wealthiest philosopher of the day. He was paid a great deal to teach rhetoric, and he would pay Lais the full fare for her services. And people would come to Aristippus and say, this is not philosophical behavior. And Aristippus said, no, it's absolutely fine. I possess Lais. Lais doesn't possess me. And the question Diderot is asking is, does he possess the dressing gown, or does the dressing gown possess him? And he hopes that he's like Aristippus, which is a step down from being like Diogenes, but it's still being a philosopher. But there's one exception he makes, and one remarkable lie in this essay. He's got a painting by Vernet. This is a National Gallery painting which is very similar. And he'd gone to Vernet and discussed with him what he wanted Vernet to paint, which is a wrecked scene where people are recovering on the shore and remaking their lives after surviving the wreck. And this painting is so wonderful, Diderot says, that although he'd be prepared to part with all his new possessions, he doesn't really care about them. They're really not that important to him. The Vernet is so wonderful that whatever happened, it must survive. If God were to destroy the Vernet, it would be like destroying our universe, because this is a little universe. And these are real people in some sense to Diderot. This is not a work of consumption, of marketplace. This is a work of art. This is a work of genius. And then Diderot tells a remarkable lie. He says, but that's all right, because I didn't buy the Vernet. Vernet gave it to me. This is quite different. There's no marketplace transaction here. And it's really unfortunate, because we actually have the receipt. 500 livres that Diderot paid Vernet for this painting. He did buy the Vernet. It was part of the marketplace. It was a form of consumption. And I'll stop there.
How did contemporaries, the philosopher colleagues of Diderot, react to his essay?
Well, because because it's only circulated in 13 copies.
Okay.
Nobody knows it's there until in 1772, somebody steals a copy and prints it, and then it very quickly circulates. But we don't know what Diderot. I don't think Diderot ever comments on the response to it. But I do think there's a sense in which, if you look at the paintings of Diderot, you can see all the artists are trying to dress him up. They're trying to turn him into the person that by 1769 he's trying to become. So there's a sense in which they think the philosopher oughtn't to be Diogenes, but ought to be Aristippus.
Thanks.